What's up, YouTube? It's Indian Jones, and I'm back as promised. This is week one of my movie book club, and today we're covering the first four books in the Iliad in preparation of Christopher Nolan's The Odyssey coming out this summer. I'm going to have to maintain this pace of reading four books or chapters. They're called books in the Iliad and the Odyssey. I didn't know that till I started reading it. But yeah, let's see if I can maintain the pace of doing four books a week, because I think we only have 11 more weeks till The Odyssey officially releases, and there's 48 chapters total, so 44 more to go. I'm holding you guys accountable to hold me accountable to stay on pace. So thanks. So like I mentioned before, I'm reading the Emily Wilson translation of the Iliad, and I really like it so far. But before we unpack the first four books I read, she does give a pretty lengthy introduction at the beginning of the book. Well, obviously at the beginning, where else would it be? But I thought it would be helpful to go over what she talks about in the introduction, just to give more context before we talk about the first four books. I'm not gonna lie, usually I never read these introductions before the books. I go right into the content, but this time I'm so glad I did, because it gave me so much more information that I knew nothing about beforehand. It also doesn't help that most of my Greek mythology knowledge comes from Rick Riordan and the world of Percy Jackson. The big thing that I learned that probably everyone else already knew, and it's all but confirmed, that Homer wasn't actually a singular person. The common consensus is that he's like an amalgamation or whatever combination of a lot of different poets from that time. The Trojan War was one really long story, retold and rewritten hundreds of times and told by many different poets across several generations, where they each had their own unique flares to it. And eventually it settled into distinct episodes of what we know as Homer's Iliad and the Odyssey. Wilson mentions this in her introduction as well, but apparently the more context you have about the story going into the Iliad, the better, and she goes through a lot of the overall plot of the Iliad. It's pretty much expected that all listeners know the ending, but I'll spare you the specific story details for all those people who are trying to avoid any spoilers. Although I don't even know if I'm supposed to be giving spoiler warnings for something that came out, 2,700 years ago. Also, of the epic cycle, which are the poems that cover the events of the Trojan War, the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey, are the only two completely surviving poems. For whatever reason, the other poems only survive in fragments, while the Iliad and the Odyssey are survived in full, which goes to show you how highly regarded they were in Roman and Greek history compared to the other poems. And one of the reasons Homer's poems stood the test of time is because of how narrow his scope was. He didn't try to fit too many different things into his poems like other poets did, or like screenwriters do with certain movies. I'm looking at you, Troy, 2004. There are some quotes in Aristotle's Poetics where he talks about Homer showing his artistic genius because he focuses on unity of action, I think he calls it, and tells stories of a single tragedy or story rather than a bunch of disjointed subplots. All right, here's the actual quote. Compared with all other poets, Homer may seem divinely inspired, in that even with the Trojan War, which has a beginning and an end, he did not endeavor to dramatize it as a whole, since it would have been either too long to be taken in all at once. Pause. If he had moderated the length, he would have complicated by the so I was definitely not expecting the Iliad to cover only the final year of the 10-year Trojan War, but the most baffling thing to me is that apparently the famed Trojan horse doesn't even show up in this, which is kind of crazy. I don't know. But I guess the bold choice to only focus on a very narrow scope paid off in the long run. One of the other takeaways from Wilson's introduction is how important the warrior's code is to the Greeks, and I guess warriors of that time in general. It seems like all that matters is the Greek word kleos, which means glory. There are characters in the story that love their wives and generally would mind if their wives were widowed and enslaved after they died, but they don't mind enough to give up their chance at obtaining honor. Apparently, all an elite warrior wants is to have their stories and tales remembered long in the future, even after his death.
A man dies when people forget him.
Wilson says the Iliad celebrates male achievement, male honor, and male violence, but ends with three female voices singing of lost memory and what might remain after the men are dead. Going into the Iliad, you're supposed to know how it's gonna end, but every time you read it, you still get the excitement and heartbreak of these entirely predictable plot points where you feel like you're this close to the scales turning, where you might get to a point where, oh, they're not actually going to die this time. The women might not lose their homes and freedom this time. And every time you reread it, you think there's going to be a different outcome. On that note, here's a cheery quote from Wilson in her introduction. You already know the story. You will die. Everyone you love will also die. You will lose them forever. You will be sad and angry. You will weep. You will bargain. You will make demands. You'll beg. You'll pray. It'll make no difference. Nothing you can do will bring them back. You know this. Your knowing changes nothing. This poem will make you understand the unfathomable truth again and again as if for the very first time. Holy shit, that was intense. Yeah, we're in for a ride with this poem. And I guess it makes sense because she says over and over that the Iliad is mainly about loss and compensation, obtaining glory or recompense of your loss, I guess. And at the center of it all is human mortality. Yay. But to end on an actual cheery note, she does mention in the introduction that the Iliad is really good about making the world feel alive and lived in. Okay, now we can get to the actual content of the Iliad, but before I unpack the first book, I think it's important to set the background of where and when this takes place, because we really do get dropped in the middle of the Trojan War with the expectation that we already know how we got to where we are at the start of the first book. And maybe I'm just uncultured and you guys already know this, but I'll explain it quickly anyways. So pre-Trojan War, there was a wedding between Peleus and Thetis. I'm going to butcher a lot of names throughout this process, forgive me. They would go on to give birth to Achilles, but at their wedding, there was the goddess Eris who brought a golden apple, the apple of discord, which she said this should go to
the fairest one of all.
Aphrodite, Athena, and Hera all wanted the apple, obviously, and Zeus, the indecisive king, decided to not make a decision that would burn two bridges and pawned off the decision to Paris from Troy. And Paris was then bribed by all three goddesses. Hera would give him power, Athena would give him lots of wisdom, and Aphrodite would give him the prettiest mortal woman on earth. All bribes that are hard to say no to, especially as a mere mortal, but I don't think he was thinking with his brain when he sided with Aphrodite, who then forced Helen from Sparta to fall in love with Paris and go to Troy even though she was already married to Menelaus. But that's how we get the famous Helen of Troy, as she goes with Paris and the Trojans to Troy with little to no agency, but it's unclear if she was fully unhappy. But Menelaus, her husband, was definitely unhappy to see her leave, and that was grounds enough for him and his brother Agamemnon to get an army together, attack the Trojans, and attempt to get Helen back. Unfortunately, a product of this era is how women a lot of times are seen as prizes or proof of the actual battle and necessary for you to actually get credit of your battle accomplishments. So if you came back without a trophy, that battle technically didn't happen for you, and it's a horrible look for the past, looking back now and reading it, but it does come up a lot in the story, so brace yourselves. But losing your wife to a kingdom that you were hosting for a wedding is crazy work. Wars have been started for far less, but the judgment of Paris really sets the Trojan War into motion. And it doesn't help that you have Athena and Hera supporting the Greeks because they're so mad at Paris for choosing Aphrodite over them for the apple of discord. Anyways, let's jump 9 years into the future where book 1 of the Iliad takes place. Book 1. That's my audiobook voice. If anyone wants to hire me, let me know. So we're 9 years into the Trojan War, and the Greeks' quest to get Helen back for Menelaus is still ongoing. In these 9 years, the Greeks have ransacked, pillaged, and taken over a lot of neighboring cities as they work their way towards Troy. The commander of the army is Agamemnon, who was the brother of Menelaus, and throughout the pillaging, all the commanders have had their fair share of taking women as spoils of war. The notable women so far are Chryseis, who was taken by Agamemnon, and Briseis, who was given to Achilles. But Chryseis' father is a priest of Apollo and offers Agamemnon a ransom to get his daughter back, but Agamemnon is like, hell no, she's mine now. So her father then prays to Apollo, and Apollo's like, you're a great follower of mine, so I got you. And Apollo starts destroying the Greeks and raining fire on them and won't stop till Chryseis is returned to her father. And of course, Agamemnon is a baby about it and doesn't want to return her without proper compensation, so he's like, if I have to give up my trophy, I'm taking someone else's. He then sets his sights on Briseis, who is the trophy of Achilles, and Achilles obviously gets pissed and is like, no, I'm not letting you have her. But after Chryseis is given away, Agamemnon goes to take Briseis anyways. And the only thing stopping Achilles from killing Agamemnon is Athena coming in to stop him, because she knew that if these two took each other out, the Greeks would have no chance of winning against the Trojans, whom her and Hera want to take down, obviously, after Paris didn't give either of them the apple. Even though for a second Achilles did take the high road by not killing Agamemnon, he later goes to his ship and cries to his mommy. Achilles says he's done fighting for the Greeks and begs his mom to ask Zeus to support the Trojans and have them do well against the Greeks, so Achilles' presence is really missed. And then the gods have a discussion about Zeus' decision to help the Trojans out, and when Hera opposes him, he says, the others won't help you when I lay my overwhelming hands on you, and That's to Hera, a full-on god, which is wild. Yeah, the treatment of women here early on is already crazy, with the non-god women labeled as trophies and Zeus threatening his wife, but at least that seemed slightly less serious and kind of more of a push and pull rather than the mortal women. But yeah, so far every character introduced here is pretty soft, and it's clear that everything revolves around Kleos, or glory. Glory was clearly everything to these warriors, and I guess their trophies of war were the currency of how they were viewed in society. And if you didn't come back with a trophy, everyone would be questioning if you actually conquered the city at all. So of course Agamemnon is pissed when he loses his trophy, and since he needed some recompense, he took Achilles' trophy, who then Achilles gets mad and feels undermined and decides to sit out on the war and throw a fit and let his men die because he's not happy. Who do you guys think is more to blame, Achilles or Agamemnon, for this whole situation? Obviously, both people are being soft, and Achilles is noted to be one of the youngest commanders, so maybe it's Achilles' fault for not following his higher-ups' orders. I also think it's important to remember that this whole Trojan War is because a woman has been taken from Menelaus against his will, and Agamemnon taking Briseis from Achilles not only undermines Achilles, but the whole premise of the war. It just goes to show you how stupid the reasoning for starting wars could be. Okay, let's talk about book 2 now. This book was a lot of filler, not gonna lie, so this should be pretty quick. It starts with Zeus listening to a woman for once. Clap it up for Zeus, that's progress. He listens to Thetis, Achilles' mom, who makes a request to make the Greeks look bad by suffering casualties at the hands of the Trojans, so Achilles can be seen as the necessary important figure to the Greek side. So Zeus sends a dream delivered to Agamemnon in the form of Agis' trusted advisor Nestor, convincing him now's the time to launch a full-blown attack on the Trojans, even though the Greeks probably aren't ready to do it and would suffer a lot of casualties. And Agamemnon's ready to go with this information, but for some stupid reason he wants to test his men before they move forward to attack Troy. Honestly, his test made no sense to me. It's telling his men that Zeus came to him in a dream and told him to retreat so the men could go back to their families, and obviously his men are going to do that because they want to go home, see their children, their wives. And especially if Zeus is the one commanding them, like, why wouldn't they do that? Yeah, that was a stupid-ass test by him, unless he's cocky enough to think his men would actually disobey Zeus to follow him, which could be the case. As his men are about to turn and run, Hera and Athena had to intervene and tell Odysseus, our glorious king, to call the men back. And Odysseus is able to rally the troops and remind them about the prophecy that was spoken about how it would take 9 years before the Greeks could finally take Troy, and how they vowed they wouldn't abandon their mission till the city fell. He was definitely convincing and knew how to get the people going and how to handle higher-ups and common men, one with words and one with force. The rest of the book talks about all the people on the Greek side who were lined up to fight, and the narrator got a chance to give a rundown on all these characters. I did find it funny how they randomly shoehorned the children of Heracles, or Hercules as he's more commonly known, into the roll call that they were doing of the Greek ships that were lined up. What's interesting though is that Zeus also sends a message to the Trojans telling them about the Greek formation so they can get their own troops ready. One thing I noticed 2 books in is that there's a lot of repetition, and maybe that's because the Iliad was meant to be read out loud, but it's funny, like every time they mention Odysseus, they always say he has a cunningness that rivals Zeus. Like, we get it, he's smart, you don't need to keep telling me over and over again. Alright, let's get to book 3. The 2 armies are lined up and ready to start the war, and Paris, the person basically responsible for the war by taking Menelaus' wife, Helen, started parading along the front lines on his horse, calling for people to fight in single combat. And everyone was talking about how great and strong he looked, but when Menelaus actually agreed to fight Paris, he immediately backed out and retreated like such a coward. Then his older brother Hector actually started roasting him and calling him soft for backing out and saying how shameful he is. Hector says, "You are the very best at looking pretty," and honestly I really fuck with that energy of him calling him out. But after that verbal abuse from his older brother, Paris finally agrees to the fight with Menelaus, and it's declared that the winner of the contest will get to have Helen as their wife. And the war between the Trojans and the Greek would finally come to an end with limited bloodshed. Everyone agrees to the terms of the fight, and the proper sacrifices are made to establish the goodwill of the contract, I guess. And while this is happening, the goddess Iris, disguised as Hector's sister, visits Helen and tells her to go watch the fight and give Priam, the current king of Troy, information about the Greeks on the battlefield. Also, if you didn't know, Priam is the father of both Hector and Paris, which makes him Helen's father-in-law. When the fight begins, neither Menelaus or Paris are able to kill each other with the initial spear throws, but Menelaus is able to make contact and then later grabs Paris by the helmet, but as he's doing it, we get more god intervention from Aphrodite, who obviously favors Paris, and she makes the helmet break in Menelaus' hand so he can't get a proper hold of Paris. And when Menelaus finally is able to grab a spear and try to kill him, Paris vanishes mysteriously. It's Aphrodite who pulls Paris from the battlefield and teleports him to his bedroom. And then she goes to Helen and encourages her to go meet Paris in the bedroom. And I thought it was pretty impressive that Helen was the first person to actually talk back to a god, at least even slightly, even though she does eventually go to the bedroom. The first thing she does, though, is roast Paris for being a coward, but eventually she does end up sleeping with him while everyone else outside is looking for Paris. It's crazy, though, because everyone outside, both Greeks and Trojans, have an understanding that Menelaus has won the battle and the fight is over and Helen should be going with the Greeks and the bloodshed would end. And it doesn't help because most people on the Trojan side don't even like Paris because he's just there to look pretty and be a coward, which is pretty hilarious. One thing that I was confused at during this book was Helen's intentions. It really did seem like she wanted to go back to Greece and missed home, but it's so hard to tell whether she went with Paris willingly in the first place or even at the end of this book. Throughout a lot of the story, it's hard to tell which actions are actually made by the characters and their free will and which are pushed forward by the gods, especially Helen's decisions. I know Aphrodite was the decision maker in Helen going to Troy, but she seems to have a pretty good relationship with her father-in-law, Priam, and doesn't hate her life, so maybe she did go willingly, but who's to say for sure? Maybe there's a chance she had just gotten tired of Menelaus and fell to the charm of Paris and went to Troy on her own, and eventually she got to a point, especially in this book, where she missed her homeland and wanted to go back. Or she could have gone fully against her will and just eventually accepted her fate. The craziest part, though, is that Menelaus won the fight with supposed honor, but Paris is the one who ends up sleeping with Helen right after. It almost feels like Helen knew Menelaus was more honorable and should be the right decision, but decided to follow to her more sexual desires with Paris. I do feel bad for her. No matter how you slice it, she clearly doesn't have full agency of her situation, but at times it feels like she's doing what's best for her in the moment rather than what's actually the right thing to do. But it's hard to tell if she's doing it because of Aphrodite in her ear or because she actually wants to do it. Now we're on book 4 of the Iliad. This is when the gods really start getting involved and taking control of the story. We see a lot of it from their point of view now. And it starts with Zeus teasing Hera and Athena, saying he's going to make nice between the Greek and Trojans since Menelaus clearly won the battle and the agreement was made already for a peace treaty. But Hera wants the Trojans to suffer because of the Judgment of Paris incident and convinces Zeus to allow it to happen, which marks the second time he listens to a woman, so Zeus. And he sends Athena down to convince one of the Trojan soldiers named Pandarus to shoot an arrow at Menelaus, even though the battle is technically over, and she makes it so he hits Menelaus, but directs the arrow so it barely does any damage. Apparently, the Greeks viewed bows as cowardly compared to hand-to-hand combat, so this sneak attack arrow definitely incited a lot of rage. Agamemnon also goes on this crazy long rant thinking Menelaus was badly hurt, but Menelaus was like, dude, chill, it's just a flesh wound, I'm all good, which was pretty funny. But the medical person did have to suck the blood out of him, so maybe they were worried about poison or something. This results in both sides saying, screw the truce, the battle is on. The Trojans advance and Agamemnon walks around his Greek troops, getting them ready for battle, seeing who's willing to fight, and he talks with Nestor and clever Odysseus and a bunch of others to make sure that they're ready to go. A bit of a tangent, but there's a cool bit of conversation with Nestor and Agamemnon where Nestor talks about the pros and cons of aging, about how his mind is still smart and sharp, but his body can't keep up now, so he commands those that are younger than him. It's crazy. 2,700 years later, humans still have the same problems. But anyways, we get so much bloodshed on both sides, all because the gods wanted more violence from their toys. We get a mini civil war with Apollo and Aphrodite supporting the Trojans and Hera and Athena supporting the Greeks, with Zeus kind of in the middle so far. This is literally like people drinking wine and poking humans with a stick or taking turns between them on the controller like it's a video game for their own personal pleasure. One thing I did notice though is that there is more of a push and pull between the gods than I thought initially. Zeus has control over Hera, but she has control over him as well, and ultimately she gets him to do what she wants with Troy. And as a result, the efforts of a truce are clearly gone at the end of this book. So far, this poem has been great, and I'm glad that I happened to break up the reading section this way, because the first 4 books really showcase the failure of diplomacy. It's cool that even though it's from the perspective of the Greeks, the poem doesn't paint the Trojans in a bad light. Both sides have their flaws and redeeming qualities, and they're both ready to call a truce and have peace between them, but because of Athena, we and the people are robbed of that. But this is the true start of bloodshed in the Iliad and losing comrades. And in this book, we see clever Odysseus go into a rage after one of his close comrades die. And something tells me we're going to see a lot more rage from comrades dying down the line. Also, if you made it this far, like, subscribe, follow, please, especially if you want me to keep posting my breakdowns of the Iliad. And let me know, who are your favorite characters so far and who are your least favorite characters? Also, who are you more in line with, the Trojans or the Greeks? But my biggest question of the week is, what do you guys think of Helen? Whose side is she on and how much is she really at fault for her actions? I know the gods have had their hand in influencing her decisions and her actions, but How much of it is actually her? All right, that's a wrap. I'll catch you guys next week for books 5 through 8 of the Iliad. Peace.